Okay, I'll be first to admit that the time between the updates to this series is pretty obscene, but you do what you can with having a day job and whatnot. But anyways, let's move on to the next video in regards to lesson stuff. Today we want to talk about a special feature from mags known as Photon Blasts. Photon Blasts are essentially special attacks that your mag will get as it levels up. Every time it evolves, it has a new particular Photon Blast that it'll learn. Depending on what it evolves into, it'll get you one of either 6 different Photon Blasts. You can't have 2 copies of the same thing, so if what it evolved into has one you already have, then you'll just get nothing, and then it'll attempt to learn something as it evolves into something else. Photon Blasts will usually be special attacks, but sometimes they're more supportive, like this one here that heals you. They vary in terms of usefulness, but you can usually find a use for all of them. Now, as I mentioned previously, mags will evolve at first at various set levels, 10, 35, and 50, and then after that, they'll try to evolve at every multiple of 5, depending on if they've met the conditions for a different form. Now, keeping all this in mind, you can try to get yourself set up with the 3 Photon Blasts you prefer. The tricky thing always being those first couple, since you need to make sure to have a different character feeding it if you don't like the starting Photon Blast on your character type. Such as not liking Varla if you happen to be a hunter, or maybe not liking Lyla if you happen to be a force, and you instead want to have the ranger starting Photon Blast, as the first form of the mag is very limited. Right, the next thing to go over is going to be each of the Photon Blasts, one by one. I'll go ahead and let you know what the strengths and weaknesses of each are, and just what you should probably be using them for. First up, we have what may as well be the beginner's Photon Blast, Photon Blast Varla. This one unleashes a small wave of fire damage directly around you, so it's easy to aim and easy to use. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually do very much damage overall, even in the long run, and most enemies do have some fire resistance, so its damage gets heavily nerfed, especially later in the game. It's good for the first couple of difficulty levels where things' elemental resistances aren't that great, but overall, it's just a weaker version of a later Photon Blast. Just to make matters worse, Karla actually has a negative impact on a mechanic that I'm going to be talking about a little later in this video too. The poor thing really doesn't have any strengths involved with it at all. I mean, you should probably just avoid getting it if you can. On your hunters, if you have another character available that you can train the mag on at first instead, I'd recommend it, as the other 2 starting Photon Blasts are considerably better. Speaking of better starting Photon Blasts, here's Photon Blast Esla. This one's a bit more difficult to aim since it just goes in a straight line. It's the starting range of Photon Blast, but it can hit a huge amount of enemies if you aim it correctly, unlike this. And the damage it does is completely ridiculous compared to most other Photon Blasts. The big thing here about it is that it is actually light elemental. That makes all the difference in the world, as there's a lot of enemies that don't actually resist that very much, as it's meant to be the strongest element. This one thing alone makes this Photon Blast a lot more powerful than most others, and thus, it's probably my recommended of the 3 starting ones, just because you can get the most use out of its damage. The recommended place to use this would be firing it off against groups of enemies you find exceptionally annoying or struggle with. As long as they don't resist light, you'll be fine. If they do, it's not gonna really do anything, but you'll learn with time. The only real weakness of this Photon Blast is how difficult it is to aim compared to others. Just because it's a perfectly straight line, it doesn't have the widest hitbox. It does hit behind itself slightly though, so there is that. So once you get around those little things, it's probably the most powerful Photon Blast in the game. Finishing off the starting trifecta is Photon Blast Lyla. This one's super basic since all it really does is heal you and remove any status conditions, but it'll usually be a full heal if you're using a force character, so it has its uses here and there. On top of that, it actually synergizes really well with mechanics I'll be going over slightly later to do things such as heal and revive your teammates. So while it doesn't actually do any damage, it does have purposes outside of that. There are another 3 Photon Blasts after the initial trifecta. Coming up first is Photon Blast Pilla. This is the one that I was talking about, this just a stronger version of Varla. This one's also light elemental and has much higher base damage, so the performance on this is completely different. It's absolutely devastating to anything directly around you. This one probably has the highest base damage in the game, but it's a little less effective against groups than Esla, just because you have to get up right up close for it to actually work. That said, if you want something that's completely devastating and will deal with many different groups of enemies quite smoothly, this is the one for you. This is another Photon Blast that really doesn't have a weakness. It has short range, so that's about as close to one as you're going to get, But really, if you run into something that's light resistant, other than resisting it entirely, its base damage is so high that it will probably still do more damage than Varla, even if the enemy's weak to fire! Yeah, the difference between the two of them is really quite sad. Just take Pillow over Varla any day. Oh boy. Next up we have Photon Blast Gola. Now this thing does have the highest base damage out of any Photon Blast, but there's a severe problem. Only hits one enemy. On top of that, it's also Lightning Element, which almost nothing in the game is actually weak to after the first few difficulty levels. That's just quite pathetic. So while this thing does have the potential to really hurt, there's so few things you can actually use it on. Most bosses aren't even weak to electricity either. Yeah, this thing really doesn't have any strengths, other than if you happen to find that one majestic enemy it works on. But the weaknesses are so enormous on this thing, I just would not even bother with it. Finally, we have the best Photon Blast to use when you're not by yourself, Lyla and Lyla, also known as twins. This one just gives you an attack and defense buff, and depending on how strong your mag is, it can be equivalent to around a level 20 support spell, which is honestly really good. However, they work extremely well with other mechanics that we'll be introducing here in a moment. Simply put, this is the key to becoming as godlike powerful as possible, but you need to have a group of friends first. The strength of this Photon Blast really depends on whether or not you'll be playing with friends or just with other people in general, and what type of character you're using. If you're playing as a force, then chances are this Photon Blast won't interest you very much, as your support spells are going to be better than this thing's maximum power anyways. Now, if you're playing a non-force character, if you're a female that's not an android, then it's going to be just about as powerful as your maximum spell, so it's not a terrible thing to have. But everybody else, it's a great spell to have. For many characters, this is their only way to actually receive attack and defense buffs if they're by themselves, so it's a great ability to have. Especially since at maximum power, it actually lasts for quite a long time. So really, especially for android characters, this is a very important Photon Blast to get. So make sure you kind of plan in advance where you're going to be learning this particular one, and just try your best to get it onto your mag. One thing to go over quickly is how you get a Photon Blast in the first place. Of course, your mag has to have at least evolved once, so you can have one available, but what happens is, this will allow the meter in the upper left-hand corner there to start filling. This meter will fill as you take damage, as you deal weapon damage, and if there's certain units that will actually generate it just by walking around. Now the big key there is weapon damage, so forces are kind of pathetic at actually filling their bar, since dealing magic damage with spells doesn't do a darn thing, which is a huge pain, because often you need to rely on them anyways. But once it reaches 100, your second action palette will become your available Photon Blasts, and then you'll be able to trigger it at will. Of course, what this does mean is that they often get set off by accident, because people want to be using what moves are on that second action palette, but you gotta work with what you can. It's a little harder to trigger by accident in Blue Burst just because you have the action keys at the bottom available with the number buttons. Photon Blasts only really reach their maximum power when you have multiple people in your party, because I want to go over Photon Blast chaining. This is what really brings off the power that these things can offer, as by yourself, they're really not all that potent, but by mixing Photon Blasts together, you can get some really powerful results. In order to chain Photon Blasts, all you have to do is have multiple players use them at the same time. This will heavily increase the potential of all Photon Blasts involved within the chain. The big thing here is that while you can bump up the attack power of some of these Photon Blasts, combining them with twins is where the real potential lies. While the default strength for twins' buff is around level 20 support spells, a successful chain with 3 other players can actually ramp that up to around level 80 support spells. You're pretty much going to feel like a god whenever you actually pull this one off, because you'll be doing an obscene amount of damage compared to any other time. Now there are some rules in Photon Blast chaining that you have to follow though. The big one is that you cannot use the same Photon Blast more than once. They must be 4 different Photon Blasts. So that's why it's not such a bad thing to have something like Gola on your Photon Blast list, because most people don't have that one, so it gives you another option to add to the chain. Another rule to follow is if your mag Synchro level has fallen too low, you should probably stay out of the Photon Blast chain, because what this will do is it'll make the buff last for a much shorter amount of time, and be a lot less potent than it would be if you had just stayed out of it. But there is an option for those who are not currently able to either have a full Photon Blast to offer, or if their mag is just, kind of in a crummy state, it would actually have a negative impact. As long as your Photon Blast bar is at least 10% full, You can actually donate to somebody's Photon Blast while it's activating. By default, the buttons for this are the home key on Blue Burst and the Y button on the GameCube version. What this will do is it will give 10% each time you press it to the Photon Blast in use to help ramp up its power. By donating to it, it doesn't actually depend on your mag's own statistics, it will just give it a flat boost, so this can allow you to add to a Photon Blast chain, or just try to ramp up the power or something without having to worry about the condition your mag is currently in. You can donate up to 3 times for 30% of a boost, but there's only a couple of Photon Blasts you're really going to want to do this with. You might want to donate once for Photon Blast Lyla, as you are able to donate Photon Blast energy while dead. So if you happen to be dead, and somebody's activating this Photon Blast, donating to it will actually revive you up to full health, so that's one thing you can do with it. You can also just donate to Twins to increase its power without having to worry about your Synchro messing it up, and it'll still add a pretty decent boost. Apparently Twins will also revive you, but I haven't actually seen that one done myself. And then comes the subject of Photon Blast Varla. If you're doing a Photon Blast chain with attacking in mind, keep this thing out of it. It'll add fire element to the attack, and as a result that will usually cause the attack to do less damage than if you just used the Photon Blast by itself. It really is quite pathetic that this thing has such a negative impact on it, but such is the way of the beginner Photon Blast. Oh well. Thus, with all this in mind, the best Photon Blast chain to do is probably Tesla, Pilla, Lyla, and Twins. Just because that way you get a full heal, you get a maximum strength buff, and you get the 2 best attacking Photon Blasts out there. Now, getting 4 players to do a Photon Blast is kind of a pipe dream, especially if there's a force in your party, because let's face it, everybody has to not accidentally use one, and if you do have a force in your party, they take freaking forever to actually fill their meter because they don't do weapon damage more often than not, and they tend to stay out of the way so they're not getting as hit as often as other characters. So, yeah, if there's a character you might want to actually use a Photon Blast generating unit on it, it could just be a force so you could help out the team and, you know, have a Photon Blast ready maybe. That wraps up everything I wanted to cover about Photon Blast for today, though. So just remember, choose your Photon Blast wisely. If you're just playing the game by yourself, then choose whichever ones you think will be the most useful. In that case, they'd probably end up being Esla, Pilla, and Twins, but if you're a force, you might want something else on that 3rd slot. Other than that, just remember to do Photon Blast chaining when you can, when you're with friends, and try to keep your mag's Synchro and IQ up, as it'll increase the strength of these Photon Blasts in the first place, as well as how long they last in terms of the buff. It's one of those things, they have a lot of potential, but they do take a lot of caring for your mag, but, you know, you'll help make things a lot easier every now and then. That covers everything I wanted to do in this lesson, though, so next time we'll be talking about everybody's favorite thing, the whole wide world, min-maxing. Oh boy. Yeah, we'll go over how to try to more optimally raise your character's stats to get to something that'll actually be a bit more desirable in the later levels. Until then, though, catch you guys next time, which will hopefully not be another several months. I'll try to make these a little bit faster this time. I just have to be in the right mood. See you guys next time!